Imagine being abandoned on one of the world's most deadly mountains, your legs shattered beyond recognition, with no hope of rescue. Now imagine your best friend making the most controversial decision in mountaineering history, cutting the rope that connects your lives together. This is not fiction. This is the shocking true story of Joe Simpson, a man who crawled back from the dead and divided the mountaineering world forever. What would you do if you were Simon Yates? Would you cut that rope to save your own life? Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about friendship, survival, and the human spirit. In the industrial city of Sheffield, England, during the cold winter of 1960, Joe Simpson was born into a working-class family that never imagined their son would one day face death on the world's most treacherous peaks. Growing up in the shadow of steel factories and coal mines, young Joe found his escape in the nearby Peak District Mountains. While other boys his age were playing football in the streets, Joe was already developing what would become a dangerous obsession with vertical rock faces and impossible climbs. His parents, Ian and Sarah Simpson, watched with growing concern as their teenage son spent every weekend disappearing into the mountains. Sarah would often stand at the kitchen window, watching Joe pack his climbing gear with an intensity that frightened her. She knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look her father had when he talked about the war. It was the look of someone who needed danger to feel alive. By his early 20s, Joe had already established himself as one of Britain's most promising young mountaineers. He was fearless, some said reckless, pushing boundaries that more experienced climbers wouldn't dare cross. It was this reputation that caught the attention of Simon Yates, an equally ambitious climber from Leicestershire. When they first met at a climbing festival in North Wales in 1984, it was like two forces of nature recognizing each other. Simon was everything Joe wasn't: methodical, where Joe was impulsive; cautious, where Joe was daring. Yet they shared something deeper than climbing techniques or equipment preferences. They shared an addiction to the impossible. Within months of meeting, they were planning what would become the most infamous expedition in mountaineering history. The target was Ciudad Grande in the Peruvian Andes, specifically its unclimbed western face. At 20,814 feet, it wasn't the highest peak in the region, but it was considered one of the most technically challenging. Previous expeditions had failed, and many veteran climbers considered it a death trap. For Joe and Simon, this made it irresistible. In May 1985, they arrived in Peru with minimal support, carrying everything they needed on their backs. Local guides in the village of Cayatambo warned them about the mountain's reputation. La montaña que devora hombres, they called it. The mountain that devours man. Joe laughed off these warnings, but Simon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. The ascent began flawlessly. For 3 days, Joe and Simon climbed with the precision of a well-oiled machine, conquering technical ice walls and treacherous rock faces that had defeated seasoned expeditions. The weather held, their equipment performed perfectly, and their partnership seemed unbreakable. By the morning of May 25th, they stood triumphant on the summit of Ciudad Grande's western face, the first humans ever to achieve this feat. But mountains have a way of punishing hubris, and Ciudad Grande was about to exact a terrible price. The descent began routinely enough. In mountaineering, climbers often say that reaching the summit is only half the battle. Getting down alive is what separates legends from cautionary tales. Joe was leading the descent down a steep ice slope when the seemingly solid snow beneath his feet gave way. In a split second that would haunt both men forever, Joe plummeted down the face, his right leg slamming into an ice ledge with a sickening crack that Simon heard from 150 feet above. When Simon rappelled down to find his friend, the scene that greeted him was something from a nightmare. Joe's leg was bent at an impossible angle, the bone protruding through his climbing suit. Blood was already beginning to freeze in the -20-degree temperature. Joe's face was white with shock, but his eyes were still alert, still fighting. Simon's mind raced through their options. They were at 19,000 feet, miles from the nearest help, in weather that was rapidly deteriorating. Joe couldn't walk, couldn't put any weight on the destroyed limb. and carrying him was impossible on terrain this technical. By every rational measure, they were both going to die on that mountain. But Simon refused to accept defeat. For the next 6 hours, he attempted the impossible, lowering Joe down the mountain face using their climbing ropes. It was agonizingly slow work, with Joe screaming in agony every time his shattered leg struck rock or ice. The storm that had been threatening all day finally hit with full fury, turning their desperate rescue into a battle against time, physics, and the mountain itself. As darkness fell and hypothermia began to set in, they reached a point where their ropes could no longer reach solid ground. Joe was suspended over what appeared to be a bottomless crevasse, unable to climb back up, too injured to be pulled to safety. Simon, anchored above on rapidly failing ice, felt the terrible weight of his friend slowly pulling them both toward death. What happened next would spark debates in mountaineering circles for decades to come. After an hour of holding Joe's weight in deteriorating conditions, with frostbite beginning to claim his fingers and exhaustion clouding his judgment, Simon Yates made a decision that would define both their lives forever. He reached into his pack, pulled out his knife, and cut the rope. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments below, because what we're about to tell you next will challenge everything you think you know about this story. The sensation of falling was almost peaceful for Joe Simpson. After hours of excruciating pain, the sudden weightlessness felt like relief. He plummeted through the darkness, his mind surprisingly calm as he prepared to die. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. But death, it seemed, wasn't ready for Joe Simpson yet. He landed on a snow bridge 60 feet down in a crevasse so deep that daylight barely penetrated its depths. The impact should have killed him instantly, but somehow, miraculously, his broken body absorbed the blow. When consciousness returned, Joe found himself in what he would later describe as a blue-white cathedral of ice, suspended between life and death in the bowels of Ciudad Grande. The silence was absolute. No sound from above, no sign of Simon, no indication that the outside world still existed. Joe's headlamp revealed walls of ice stretching up into blackness above and down into an abyss below. His water bottles had shattered in the fall, his radio was destroyed, and his right leg hung at an angle that made him nauseous to look at. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. Your engagement means everything to us, and I promise you, the most incredible part of this story is still to come. Most people would have given up in that moment. Trapped in a frozen tomb with a shattered leg, no way to signal for help, and no reasonable hope of rescue, Joe had every excuse to simply close his eyes and wait for the end. But something in the Sheffield steel of his character refused to surrender. Using techniques he'd learned from his father's war stories and his own climbing experience, Joe began to assess his situation with methodical precision. He had some food, no water except what he could melt from the ice walls, a sleeping bag, and most importantly, an ice axe and crampons. The crevasse had 2 possible exits: up the way he'd fallen, which was impossible with his injuries, or down into the unknown depths below. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Joe made a decision that defied all logic. He would rappel deeper into the crevasse, hoping to find a way out at the bottom. It was almost certainly suicide, but it was action, and action meant hope. The descent into the deeper darkness took 3 hours. With each foot he lowered himself. The walls grew closer together, the cold more intense, the silence more oppressive. His broken leg screamed with every movement, and more than once he nearly passed out from the pain. But finally, incredibly, his headlamp illuminated something that shouldn't have existed. A slope of snow leading upward toward a distant glimmer of light. Joe had found a way out of his icy tomb, but he was still miles from safety, with a leg that couldn't support his weight, in weather conditions that killed experienced mountaineers with all their equipment intact. His real journey was just beginning. What followed was 3 days of crawling, sliding, and dragging himself across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Joe Simpson's journey back from the dead became a masterclass in human endurance that defies every medical and psychological understanding of what the human body and mind can withstand. Unable to walk, Joe developed a technique he called the crawl. using his ice axe and good leg to pull himself forward in agonizing 6-foot intervals. He crawled across glacier fields where crevasses could swallow him without warning. He dragged himself over rock fields that shredded his clothing and skin. He slid down slopes of loose scree that could have triggered avalanches at any moment. The physical pain was indescribable, but it was the mental battle that nearly broke him. Hypothermia brought vivid hallucinations. He held conversations with family members who weren't there, argued with voices only he could hear, and sometimes forgot why he was crawling at all. But somehow, buried deep in his consciousness, the will to survive kept driving him forward. Water became his obsession. The few sips he could melt from snow weren't nearly enough to prevent severe dehydration. In desperation, Joe began drinking his own urine, a survival technique that probably saved his life, but added another layer of degradation to his ordeal. Food was equally scarce. A few energy bars had to sustain him through 3 days of the most physically demanding experience imaginable. Meanwhile, Simon Yates was fighting his own battle with guilt and grief at base camp. He had spent 2 days shouting Joe's name into the wind, searching every accessible area for signs of his friend, before accepting the horrible reality that Joe was dead and he was responsible. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. He had saved his own life by cutting the rope, but at what cost? On the morning of the 3rd day, Simon made preparations to leave base camp and return to civilization. He would have to live with the knowledge that he had abandoned his best friend to die on a mountain, and somehow find a way to explain to Joe's family what had happened. The guilt was already eating him alive. But as he packed his equipment, Simon heard something impossible. A voice calling his name. Weak, barely human, but unmistakably familiar. He thought his grief-stricken mind was playing tricks on him until he saw a figure crawling across the moraine toward camp. It was Joe Simpson, returned from the dead, his face blackened by frostbite, his clothes in tatters, but incredibly, impossibly alive. The reunion between Joe Simpson and Simon Yates at base camp was one of the most emotionally charged moments in mountaineering history. Simon later described it as seeing a ghost. He had spent 3 days mourning his friend's death, accepting responsibility for cutting the rope, and preparing to live with that burden forever. Joe's first words weren't accusation or anger. They were simply, "Simon, I knew you'd wait for me." The relief and joy in Simon's face was visible even through the shock and disbelief. He had been given an impossible gift, the chance to save his friend's life a second time. But Joe's ordeal wasn't over. His leg was catastrophically damaged, infected, and potentially gangrenous. Frostbite had claimed several of his fingers and toes. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from exposure that should have killed him days earlier. Getting him off the mountain and to medical care became their new challenge. The journey down to the nearest village took 2 more days, with Simon essentially carrying Joe on his back for much of the route. Local villagers who saw them approach later said they looked like 2 men who had seen hell and somehow found their way back. Joe was airlifted to a hospital in Lima, where doctors marveled at his survival and spent weeks reconstructing what was left of his shattered leg. The story could have ended there. A remarkable tale of survival against impossible odds. But Joe Simpson's return from Ciudad Grande sparked something much larger and more controversial. When he eventually wrote about his experience in the book Touching the Void, it became an international bestseller and later an acclaimed documentary film. But it also ignited a fierce debate within the mountaineering community about Simon's decision to cut the rope. Some called Simon a hero who made an impossible choice under unthinkable circumstances. Others branded him a coward who abandoned his partner when courage was needed most. The controversy divided climbing communities worldwide and raised fundamental questions about the ethics of high-altitude mountaineering. Joe himself never wavered in his support for Simon's decision. He argued that cutting the rope actually saved both their lives. If Simon had continued trying to hold his weight, they both would have died on that mountain. But the debate continues to this day, with new generations of climbers arguing about what they would have done in Simon's position. The physical recovery took Joe nearly 2 years. The psychological recovery took much longer. He returned to mountaineering, driven by a need to prove that Ciudad Grande hadn't broken him. But he was never quite the same climber or the same man. The mountain had changed him in ways that went deeper than his physical scars. Today, Joe Simpson's story stands as one of the most remarkable survival tales in human history. It's a testament to the power of the human spirit, the strength of friendship, and the terrible choices that extreme situations can demand. It raises questions about courage, survival, ethics, and the limits of human endurance that don't have easy answers. So what do you think? Was Simon Yates a hero who made an impossible choice? Or should he have found another way? Could you have survived what Joe Simpson endured, crawling for 3 days with a shattered leg across one of the world's most hostile environments? And most importantly, what would you have done if you were holding that rope? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These debates have been raging for decades, and every perspective adds something valuable to the discussion. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed us, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most incredible true stories of human courage, survival, and controversy every week. And don't miss our next video, where we'll explore another survival story that's equally unbelievable. The tale of a man who survived 438 days lost at sea. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about the limits of human endurance.